The marble floors of the imperial palace were stained with blood, not from war or execution, but from something far more personal and infinitely more twisted. Emperor Nero had just murdered his pregnant wife with his bare hands, and in doing so had set in motion the most disturbing love story in human history. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. This is the true account of how grief and absolute power combined to create a horror so profound that even hardened Roman historians struggled to record it. This is the story of how an emperor's obsession led him to surgically transform a teenage boy into his dead wife and force him to live as her ghost for years. Rome, 65 AD. The woman lying dead on the palace floor wasn't just any imperial wife. Poppaea Sabina had been Nero's obsession, the one person who seemed to match his grandiose vision of himself. Contemporary sources describe her as possessing almost supernatural beauty: golden hair that caught light like spun silk, skin so pale it seemed to glow, and most distinctively, enormous dark eyes that Roman poets compared to Venus herself. But here's what makes this murder even more chilling. It wasn't planned. Ancient historians tell us Nero killed her in a moment of rage. Some say with a single, devastating kick to her pregnant belly. Others describe a brutal beating. The exact method doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next, because when you've been raised to believe you're descended from gods, when you command 60 million souls, the death of your beloved isn't just loss, it's a personal insult from fate itself. Nero's response shocked even Rome's jaded aristocracy. He refused the traditional cremation, instead having her body embalmed with more spices than entire kingdoms produced in a year. He placed her in a crystal sarcophagus where he could see her, setting places for her at dinner, asking her opinion on matters of state. Palace servants reported finding the emperor having full conversations with the corpse, and this wasn't just grief, this was a complete fracture from reality. Sleep became impossible without massive doses of poppy wine. He would wake screaming Poppaea's name, convinced she was calling from the next room. But most disturbing of all, Nero started seeing her everywhere, in the face of serving girls, in the profile of senators' wives, in random women on the street. He would stop mid-sentence during crucial meetings, staring at some woman who bore even the slightest resemblance to his dead wife, sometimes terrifying innocent people by grabbing their faces and searching desperately for something that wasn't there. But grief would drive him to something far worse than conversations with corpses. It was late 65 AD when everything changed forever. Nero was forcing himself to review administrative appointments, trying to distract himself from his obsession, when a young freedman was brought forward for confirmation in a minor clerical role. The emperor looked up from his scrolls and time stopped. The boy standing before him couldn't have been more than 15, but he had Poppaea's eyes. Not similar eyes, the exact same enormous dark-lashed eyes that had first captivated Nero. The same delicate bone structure, the same unconscious way of tilting his head when nervous, even the same unusual amber flecks in his irises that caught the lamplight. Nero rose from his throne so quickly that scrolls scattered across the floor. The court held its breath as the emperor circled the terrified boy like a predator, studying prey. But there was something else in Nero's expression, a desperate hope, a manic joy that was somehow more frightening than rage. "What is your name?" Nero's voice was barely a whisper.
"Sporus, divine Augustus. I am Sporus."
Now here's the crucial detail most people don't know. Sporus wasn't just any slave. He had been born in the imperial household, his mother, a Germanic captive who died giving birth. Raised in the palace's servant quarters, he'd been educated alongside other freedmen's children, trained in Greek and Latin, marked for administrative service due to his intelligence and delicate features. But none of that mattered now. In that moment, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual. He became raw material for an emperor's delusion. Nero's examination continued for what witnesses described as an eternity. He touched the boy's face, turned it to catch different angles of light, ran his fingers through his hair. Sporus stood frozen, intelligent enough to know his life balanced on a knife's edge, but not yet understanding the full horror about to unfold. Finally, Nero stepped back. The smile that spread across his face was described by one chronicler as the expression of a man who had discovered the secret of defeating death itself. "Cancel today's appointments," Nero commanded. "Summon my personal physicians. Tell them to prepare their finest instruments. We have work to do." What happened next defied every law of nature and decency known to the ancient world. The transformation didn't begin with surgery. First, Nero needed to study his subject to understand exactly how this boy could be molded into his lost love. For weeks, Sporus was kept in luxurious chambers adjacent to Nero's own, subjected to endless examinations and measurements. The emperor brought in artists who had painted Poppaea from life, ordering them to create comparative sketches, noting where Sporus matched the dead empress and where he differed. Nero pored over these studies with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts, making notations, planning modifications. But it wasn't just physical appearance Nero was analyzing. He had Sporus speak for hours, listening to his voice, correcting his pronunciation, teaching him Poppaea's distinctive way of drawing out certain vowels. He tested the boy's walk, his gestures, the way he held his hands. Every deviation from Poppaea's mannerisms was noted for correction. The psychological torture had already begun. Sporus was forbidden to use his own name. Servants were instructed to address him as lady or mistress. His simple tunics were replaced with flowing robes in Poppaea's favorite colors. He was taught to apply cosmetics, not the simple touches appropriate for Roman youth, but the elaborate makeup of a noble woman. Can you imagine waking up each morning looking in a polished bronze mirror and watching your own face being systematically erased? Servants who attended Sporus during this period later reported that he barely spoke, barely ate, moving through his days like someone trapped in a waking nightmare. But he didn't resist. How could he? One word of complaint would mean death or worse, because by now Sporus had learned what Nero intended. The emperor spoke of his plans openly, excitedly, like an artist describing a masterpiece in progress. The physicians had been consulted, the procedures had been explained. Sporus was going to be physically transformed into a woman through castration and surgical modification. This wasn't just creating a eunuch. Roman eunuchs were common enough. This was something unprecedented, an attempt to surgically recreate feminine form, to rebuild Sporus's body into an approximation of womanhood. The night before the surgery, Nero visited Sporus in his chambers, bringing a small wooden box. Inside was Poppaea's wedding ring, a massive emerald surrounded by pearls. "Tomorrow," Nero said, sliding the ring onto Sporus's finger where it hung loosely, "you will be reborn. You will become who you were always meant to be." Sporus finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Will it hurt?" For just a moment, something almost human flickered in Nero's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that manic certainty. "Birth always hurts," he replied. "But what emerges is beautiful." But the physical transformation was only the beginning of this nightmare. The surgery took place in a specially prepared chamber in the palace medical wing. Historical records mercifully spare us the exact details, but we know it lasted hours. The screams could be heard 3 corridors away despite the thick stone walls. Nero waited outside like an expectant father, occasionally shouting encouragement through the door. The recovery took months. Infection was a constant threat in an age before antibiotics. The modifications were extensive enough that Sporus had to relearn basic functions. Through it all, Nero was a constant presence, supervising the healing, adjusting dosages of pain-dulling drugs, even helping change bandages with his own imperial hands. This tender care might seem touching until you remember its purpose. Nero wasn't nursing a person back to health, he was crafting an object to fulfill his obsession. Every gesture of kindness came with reminders of what Sporus was becoming. Nero would sit by his bedside reading Poppeia's favorite poems, telling stories about her as if Sporus should remember them, gradually blurring the line between who Sporus was and who he was being forced to become. As Sporus healed, an army of tutors descended upon him. He learned to walk in the smaller, swaying steps considered proper for Roman matrons. His hands were trained to move with studied grace. The voice training was perhaps most intensive, hour after hour practicing higher, softer tones, learning Poppeia's favorite phrases, her way of laughing, her specific intonations when addressing different court members. A wardrobe was commissioned, not just any women's clothing, but exact replicas of Poppeia's favorite garments. Imperial seamstresses recreated her most iconic dresses from preserved samples. Jewelers reset her personal collection to fit Sporus's slightly different proportions. Even her perfumes were recreated. But clothes and jewels were just the beginning. Sporus had to learn the complex rituals of Roman noble women, the hours-long beauty routines, elaborate hairstyling requiring teams of servants, proper dining etiquette, how to engage in witty but never too clever conversation. Most disturbing of all, Nero didn't just want Sporus to look and act like Poppaea, he wanted him to be Poppaea. The boy was required to study her history, memorize names of her friends, her favorite foods, her opinions on poetry and politics. When Nero reminisced about shared experiences, Sporus had to respond as if he remembered them too. The first public appearance came 6 months after surgery, a small dinner party with just Nero's closest advisors. When Sporus entered, dressed in one of Poppeia's purple gowns, her jewelry glittering in lamplight, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone had heard rumors, but seeing the transformation was something else entirely. The resemblance was uncanny. In soft lighting with expertly applied cosmetics, Sporus looked eerily like the dead empress. The way he moved, tilted his head, even smiled. It was all Poppaea, or rather, a performance so complete that cynical courtiers found themselves forgetting the truth. Nero beamed like a proud artist revealing his masterpiece, keeping one possessive hand on Sporus throughout the evening, introducing him as my beloved Sabina, using Poppeia's family name. The guests played along with enthusiasm bordering on hysteria, complimenting Sabina's beauty, asking after her health, including her in conversations as if the last months had been a strange dream. Now came the moment to present this impossible creation to the world in the most shocking way possible. The wedding announcement in early 67 AD shocked even those who thought they'd seen the depths of Nero's madness. It was proclaimed throughout Rome as if it were completely normal for the emperor to marry his surgically feminized teenage freedman. The ceremony would be a full state occasion with all traditional Roman rituals. The preparations were grotesque in their normalcy. Wedding planners consulted ancient traditions. Priests prepared proper sacrifices. The processional route was decorated with flowers and garlands. Invitations were sent to every senator, magistrate, and foreign dignitary in Rome. Declining wasn't an option. The wedding day itself was surreal. Sporus was dressed in the traditional saffron-colored veil of Roman brides, his face painted with ceremonial cosmetics. A massive dowry was formally transferred. Contracts were signed with the same legal language used for any marriage. Despite the biological impossibility of this union producing heirs, Nero played his role with disturbing sincerity. He performed traditional rituals, spoke ancient vows, even carried Sporus over the threshold as custom prescribed. The wedding feast was lavish beyond description: peacocks stuffed with songbirds, wine from Caesar's private cellars, entertainment by the empire's finest performers. Throughout it all, Roman elite maintained frozen smiles and offered congratulations. Gifts poured in, jewelry for the new empress, household goods for the imperial couple, even fertility amulets in displays of either dark humor or desperate attempts to please. Senators gave speeches praising the bride's beauty. Poets composed wedding songs. Everyone understood they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong, yet they applauded and smiled because the alternative was death. But this nightmare was just beginning for Sporus, who now faced years of living as someone else's ghost. Life as Nero's empress was a daily performance that never ended. Sporus woke each morning in Poppeia's chambers, surrounded by her possessions. Servants who had once attended the real Poppeia now dressed him in her clothes, styled his hair in her arrangements, applied cosmetics to maintain the illusion. Every gesture, every word, every expression had to be calculated. Public appearances were perhaps worst. Nero insisted on taking his wife everywhere. Sporus sat in the empress's box at gladiatorial games, was carried in her litter through streets, received ceremonial honors, due an Augusta. Romans gathered to stare at this impossible creature, a boy transformed into a dead woman's ghost. During Nero's grand tour of Greece in 67 AD, the performance reached new heights. Greeks eager to please their conquerors treated Sporus with all deference due an empress. He presided over banquets, attended Nero's artistic performances, participated in religious ceremonies reserved for the emperor's wife. But private moments revealed the true horror of Sporus's existence. Nero expected him to respond to intimacy, not just as a woman, but as Poppeia specifically. He had to know her preferences, mirror her responses, recreate private jokes and tender moments that had belonged to a dead woman. Any failure to maintain the illusion could send Nero into violent rage or worse, cold disappointment that felt like death to someone whose survival depended entirely on pleasing a madman. The imperial household treated Sporus with mixtures of pity, fear, and disgust. He existed in a strange liminal space, neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free, neither alive in his own right, nor truly the person he impersonated. Palace servants whispered about seeing him alone in gardens at dawn, standing motionless as if he'd forgotten how to exist when not performing. There were escape attempts. How could there not be? But where could someone so recognizable run? Sporus's transformed appearance, his feminine presentation, the imperial jewelry he wore at all times, everything marked him as clearly as any brand. One recorded attempt ended with crucifixion of accomplices who tried to help him, their bodies displayed where Sporus could see them from his window. Perhaps cruelest was Nero's genuine kindness. The emperor truly believed he had resurrected his beloved. He showered Sporus with gifts, spent hours in seemingly tender conversation, protected him from any slight. To observers, it might have looked like love, but how can there be love when one person has been surgically restructured to fit another's delusion? Historical accounts suggest Sporus developed what we might recognize as severe dissociative disorder. He began referring to himself as Poppeia, even when alone. Servants reported finding him having conversations with mirrors, speaking in two voices, his own and the feminine persona he'd been forced to adopt. The boundaries between Sporus and his role became increasingly blurred, perhaps his mind's only way to cope. When Nero's reign crumbled, Sporus faced an even darker fate than anything the mad emperor had devised. Spring 68 AD brought rebellions across the empire. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. As Nero fled Rome with only loyal servants, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, the emperor couldn't abandon his artificial Poppeia. Those final days in a villa outside Rome were pure madness. Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical suicide preparations. Through it all, Sporus remained by his side, still playing the devoted wife even as the empire collapsed. When news came that capture was imminent, Nero chose death. But even in his last moments, the performance continued. He asked Sporus to begin ritual lamentations, to mourn him as Poppeia would have. As Nero pressed a dagger to his throat with trembling hands, Sporus helped guide it, perhaps the only genuinely merciful act in their entire twisted relationship. With Nero dead, Sporus's nightmare should have ended. Instead, it entered a new phase. He was now a living symbol of Nero's excesses, a valuable prize for whoever claimed power. The generals fighting for the throne each saw him differently, as trophy, curiosity, or legitimizing link to the previous regime. First came Galba, who treated Sporus with cold courtesy, keeping him in the palace but largely ignoring him. For months, Sporus lived in strange twilight, still dressed as a woman, still called Sabina, but without Nero's intense focus. Galba lasted only 7 months before murder in the Forum. His successor, Otho, had known Poppaea personally. She had been his wife before Nero stole her. Otho's interest in Sporus was particularly disturbing. Did he see an echo of his lost love? A chance for revenge against Nero's memory? Sources suggest Otho treated Sporus as a legitimate widow, even promising marriage. But his reign was too brief for this plan to materialize. When Otho committed suicide after losing the Battle of Bedriacum, Sporus passed to the victor, Vitellius. And under Vitellius, this story reached its final, most brutal chapter. Vitellius was different, crude, gluttonous, caring nothing for refined cruelties. To him, Sporus wasn't a person or valuable object, but potential entertainment for the mob. The new emperor announced that Sporus would perform in a public spectacle in the Colosseum, not as a spectator in the imperial box, but as a participant in the games themselves. The plan was hideously creative. Sporus would be forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the maiden abducted by Pluto to the underworld. In this fatal performance, he would be abducted by gladiators dressed as demons and subjected to public rape before being killed for the crowd's amusement. When Sporus learned of this plan, he finally found strength that had eluded him for years. Rather than submit to this final degradation, he chose death on his own terms. Some sources say poison, others suggest he opened his veins in traditional Roman manner. All agree he died by his own hand, finally escaping the role he'd been forced to play. He was approximately 20 years old. The tragedy of Sporus raises profound questions about identity, autonomy, and the corruption of absolute power. Here was a person systematically destroyed and rebuilt to serve another's delusion. Every aspect of his existence, physical, psychological, social, was violated and reshaped. He became a living ghost, forced to impersonate someone he'd never met, to love someone who had destroyed him. What makes his story particularly haunting is how completely we've lost the real Sporus. We don't know his thoughts, dreams, or personality before Nero's attention fell upon him. That person was so thoroughly erased that even his name is uncertain. Sporus itself might have been a cruel nickname, meaning seed, or sown thing, emphasizing his transformation. The boy who entered Nero's presence that day effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a performance that continued until death finally released him. His final suicide stands as his one true act of self-determination, choosing freedom over further degradation. Perhaps most disturbing is how many people participated in his torture: physicians who performed surgery, tutors who trained him, courtiers who pretended he was Poppaea, servants who dressed him daily. Hundreds of people maintained this cruel fiction, each prioritizing their survival over a teenager's humanity. This is history's most disturbing love story because it wasn't love at all. It was the complete consumption of one human being by another's obsession. Nero didn't love Sporus, he loved the ghost he had surgically created from a living boy. And in the end, when that ghost finally chose death over further performance, it was the only authentic moment in years of forced existence. The ruins of Nero's palace still stand in Rome, buried beneath later constructions. Somewhere in those ruins are chambers where Sporus lived his stolen life, where he stood before mirrors reflecting back a stranger, where he practiced speaking in a voice not his own. The stones remember what history has largely forgotten. The boy who was forced to become a ghost and who finally found the courage to stop haunting the world, haunting the world, haunting the